Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us for tonight's event. Welcome. My name is Trevor Freeman, for those of you who haven't met me before. And tonight's event is actually the third in a series that we've been running, an Intro to Western North Carolina series. I'll explain a little bit more about that, but first I want to assure you that tonight's event is being recorded, so if you do happen to miss anything or if you have any questions, your link to this program will be available to you within just a few days of it airing. And as a reminder, all of our past recorded or virtual programs are recorded and available on our website as well. Also want to remind you to use the question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen throughout the program tonight. If you have any questions or any comments, feel free to chime in there and we'll try to get to everything at the end. Now, again, tonight's program is part of that lecture series. We've looked already at the first program on settlement in Western North Carolina and kind of the first Europeans to push into the area. And then we looked at the Cherokee, who were already here. We looked at mounds and villages with Dr. Ben Steer. And then tonight's event takes us into a community and a really special place within Western North Carolina, the Hickory Nut Gap, and also the history of the Cheryl's Inn. So we'll cover Native Americans, livestock and drovers, Civil War soldiers, tourists and stagecoaches, and many more interesting stories about the Hickory Nut Gap. And maybe nobody else is more qualified to present on this than John Ager. He's a state legislator and also a land manager of the Hickory Nut Gap Farm. John and his wife live in Fairview, and they manage the functioning Cheryl's Inn as a wedding venue. John's family has lived and operated farms in the area for 5 generations now. John is also co-founder of the Fairview Library and the Drovers Road Scenic Byway, and also the author of the book, We Plow God's Fields, which is a biography of James G.K. McClure and the history of the Farmers Federation in Western North Carolina. So without any further ado, I'll turn this over to John.
I'm out here on, just to locate where we are, for those that don't know, we are out in the far end of Fairview. Our farm is Hickory Nut Gap Farm. It's when you go through all the curves, if you're going from Asheville to Lake Lure and you go through all those curves, that's our farm. Most of the farmland is there at the bottom of the mountain. I'm in the old Cheryl's Inn right now. Annie and I live here. And it's perched on the side of the Blue Ridge. And I always like thinking about that Blue Ridge, the oldest part of some of the oldest mountains in the world. Supposedly, you know, 2 big land masses crashed together and pushed up mountains millions of years ago, mountains that at one time may have been like the Rockies or the Alps. It always gives me a lot to think about what that might have looked like in those days. If you keep going over the mountain, you'll go down into Chimney Rock, and that Hickory Nut Gorge, we call it now, you can see how the erosion has occurred there. It's just right there, and you can see the Chimney Rock itself happened to be a piece of really hard rock that didn't erode very well, and that's why it's sticking up like it does. So about, I don't know, 12,000 years ago, the first of our species showed up here, the Native Americans, and they, over those thousands of years, and again, I'm not going to talk much about them, but it's kind of presumptuous to talk about the 250 years that I know about and not talk a little bit about the 12,000 years those people lived here and their families, and how they adapted to the ecosystem. What really stands out about Western North Carolina, as I'm sure many of you know, is our biodiversity. And the Native Americans were here, you know, eating and tasting and looking for remedies, hunting, fishing, and they were able to survive and thrive here as well. And I think many of you have enjoyed learning about those people, what we know about them. They created wonderful mythic, religious, and cultural fabrics that we still fascinate us. And I have to admit, I work hard at trying to imagine what their lives were like, and I'm not very good at that. But I know it was certainly worthy of understanding, and worthy of us trying to understand. So I really want to talk about the three families that have lived here. The first family were the Ashworths, the second family were the Sherrills, and then my wife Annie's family, the McClures, came in 1916. The first family were John and Nancy Ann Ashworth, and they had been living. This was the frontier, and if you know a little history, the English, after the French and Indian War, before the Revolutionary War, were sort of broke, and they began trying to push taxes on the colonists, and that didn't work out too well. One of the things they did was the Proclamation of 1763, which forbid the settlement on the other side of the Blue Ridge. And like I said, we are located just barely on the other side of the Blue Ridge. Hickory Nut Gap and the Blue Ridge are the Eastern Continental Divide. As you know, the river that goes down Hickory Nut Gorge is called the Broad River. And the reason the river in Asheville is called the French Broad is because it used to all be French territory. It was on the other side of the Blue Ridge. French and Indian War, that land got ceded to the English, but they still didn't want any settlement because they didn't have the money to set up soldiers to sort of guard the land. And I think it's hard for us to really appreciate, although we seem to be living in a big land boom in Asheville right now, how important land was to those people. They were, when we think of the Revolutionary War, we think of, all the other issues, but one of the main issues were these frontier people who wanted land and were pushing the boundaries of the Native American land, the Cherokee lands, and it was, a very difficult. And the English thought they could just prevent it. It didn't work out that well. One of the reasons for the American Revolution was that hunger for land. And of course, one of the reasons the Cherokee fought with the English was to try to stop that. And I think about, those land dreams. And when Nancy Ann and John Ashworth decided to come up here and buy land here, and this area was still Rutherford County, Buncombe County hadn't been formed yet. We have an old deed that for when they bought one of the tracts of land up here. They ended up owning over 2,000 acres. Land was cheap. We have a deed from the state of North Carolina, the 31st year of independence, which was 1797, 250 acres at 50 shillings for every 100 acres. And it was adjoining the land where they already lived, so they were already here. So, it makes you think, how did they plan to make a living here? How was they going to find food? And, they had some money, obviously, but what was the plan? And they actually moved here with 3 slaves. The only thing I can think of is what they ended up doing, like everyone else, were raising hogs. You could have hogs, just let them run loose, eat acorns, eat chestnuts, and get fat, and then round them up. And the roads weren't much good, but you could herd them out of here. And there were some south of here. There were markets for hogs and cattle. I also sort of imagine that people were thinking that, gosh, maybe there's gold, or maybe there's precious metals, or who knows what. And people, I know my uncle-in-law used to go around digging for gold even not so long ago. So that was probably part of the dream. Nancy Ann and John Ashworth came here, perhaps even before the Revolutionary War was over. A lot of people just pushed their way on in here. We do know they were certainly here by 1800 and before that. In 1800, John Ashworth was 65 years old and Nancy was 55. So they weren't exactly a young couple. And it took an enormous amount of work, which I am sure was mostly done by their 3 slaves. And they built one of the buildings out back here is considered the oldest building in Buncombe County, maybe the oldest in West North Carolina. And it was probably the first building they built. It was a smokehouse, but it was also a place where people could run if there was an attack, whether the attack was Native Americans or maybe English during the war. It has gun ports, and those little stockades were, I think, pretty common here on the frontier. They came from what was then called Tryon County, then became Rutherford County. They owned land down there, and they first built that smokehouse. Then they built a log cabin, which is still part of this house. And if I wasn't scared this would shut off, I'd go over there and show it to you. And they seem to prosper. And you can look up on the Buncombe County slave records and see that they bought several more slaves. And I just don't know all the ways in which all these people were here working and surviving. It's something I think about a lot. John ended up dying in 1806. He would have been about my age, 70 something. So it left this fascinating woman, Nancy Ann Ashworth, who called herself Ann. And she's sort of considered the first doctor in the area. She had studied plants and all this botany here, and I'm sure learned the lore from the Cherokee. And she was well renowned for being able to cure people. She would dig lady slipper roots and brew them into a tea for treating heart trouble. One of her cures had to do with cancer. And this is a quote from her: "To cure cancer, go to a savanna bush and say, 'What did you come here for?' To cure a cancer, and break off a twig. Then say, 'Who it is on?' Break another twig. Then say where the cancer is. Break another twig. Down and go away. This must be done before sunrise, 3 mornings in succession, before speaking to any person." Well, the Baptists weren't so sure about this kind of a cure, and they decided she was a witch, and they were going to try her as a witch, and that was a pretty serious charge. So she heard about it, and she sent word down to the Baptist deacons that if they did such a thing, she would sure enough put a spell on them. And they backed off. They were afraid of her. And they decided to go for a lesser charge, that she liked to wear ruffled petticoats, and that she did not deny. Another one of her cures was, and I have no idea what this is, it was a cure for the scald head. Maybe somebody in the audience knows what a scald head is. And the cure was to take 1 pound of May butter, whatever that is, 1 pound of green tobacco, beat the tobacco well, and stew them moderately together until the strength is entirely out of the tobacco. Then take it out, then add 1/4 pound of black pepper. It's a lot of black pepper. When cool, mix them properly together, thin it fit for use, shave the head with soap and water, then grease the head and keep the same cloth until the cure is finally cured. So there you go. That maybe not quite as weird as the cancer one, but anyway, Nancy Ann Ashworth was when her husband died, the people in Fairview thought they could take advantage of that woman, and she was up to anything. She was known as a tough businesswoman. She craved money and worldly possessions. She owned slaves, like I said. She cast spells on people she didn't like. She cursed people who crossed her, and she did as she pleased, with no regard to what anyone thought. And this, of course, did not sit too well with the Baptists and others in Fairview. And it says even more than once, Anne was brought up on charges by the Fairview Baptist Church. In October of 1827, she wrote her will, leaving money or slaves to her various children and grandchildren. Those receiving cash included her grandson and some got $100. David got $500, but he had to take care of his mother. His daughter, Nancy Bridges, was going to receive her waiting clothes. I'm not sure what waiting clothes were. And she also was to receive Anne's slave, Aunt Hannah. Hannah was to be set free after Nancy's death and looked after by Nancy's sister. Betsy Merrill was to receive the slave Dempsey, and her grandson was to get, her grandson Shadrach was to get the slave George, and there were some other. One of the slaves was called the Negro wench Nalipsey, the daughter of Susanna Withrow, and I'll just, there's a little side story that's kind of interesting to me. The Susanna Withrow, who this woman was given to in the will, ended up moving to North Georgia, and a couple of months ago, a filmmaker from Montreal who was born in Algeria showed up here, and he was a direct descendant of Nancy Ann and this Susanna Withrow, knew a lot about her, and he's up there in Montreal raising money to do some sort of documentary around the theme of how do you think about yourself if you have family with a history of owning slaves or something like that. I guess we'll wait and see what it turns out to be. Nancy Ann died in 1833. She was buried in a cemetery here on the property, and she left in her will that a gallon of whiskey needed to be left for the men who dug her grave. So that was probably a happy day. They had later in May, just about this time of year in 1833, they had an estate auction here at the house, and no land was sold, but the auction generated over $3,000, which was a huge amount of money for that day and time. And there's a record of how that was all handled. So she died, and the next family was waiting in the wings. This would have been Bedford and Elizabeth Sherrill. They bought the property in 1834, and they were newly married. Bedford was 24, and Elizabeth was 15 years old when they came here. And the story for them is that the Sherrill family, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of Sherrill's Ford, which is down on the Catawba River in Catawba County. But the Sherrill family had been living there for several generations. They were the pioneering family there. And one of the things they did was set up a stagecoach run from Salisbury to Asheville. And they got one of the ways you sort of made your money was by delivering the mail. You got the mail contract. So they got that stagecoach job running, and it went right up through Rutherford County and right up Hickory Nut Gorge. At the bottom of Hickory Nut Gorge, and the building is still there. It was, way before Lake Lure was built, but it was the Elizabeth Harris lived in that old inn there. There was an inn there, and that was where the stagecoach stopped every night. So that's where Bedford met Elizabeth on one of these stagecoach runs, and they got married and moved up here to the Ashworth place, and they began to think, how could they make a living? The world had changed some. The Buncombe Turnpike was built, which was the most important sort of infrastructure project of that day. And then they began talking about building a turnpike through Hickory Nut Gap and down Hickory Nut Gorge to Rutherfordton. Rutherfordton was the big commercial town of the day, and they actually petitioned the state of North Carolina for money. They got about $10,000, and they hired a bunch of farmers with mules and drag pans to create a decent road down Hickory Nut Gorge and up this side of the mountain. If you come out here on the farm, you can see just where it was. It got badly eroded over all those years, and it's really quite interesting to think about. They also realized that with Chimney Rock and the beauty of Hickory Nut Gorge, that maybe they could attract travelers. Stagecoach riding in those days was really expensive and lucrative if you could, get your stagecoach filled up with people. One place I saw where it cost $9 to go from Charlotte to Asheville, which was a lot of money in the early 1800s. So they bought a even bigger stagecoach called Sherrill's Flying Cloud, and they would drive it. It was a slow trip and difficult trip, but they would bring the stagecoach here. So over several years they added on to this house to create Sherrill's Inn, and that's really basically the house we have now. So at about the late 1830s, this was completed. It was a house, I sort of imagined something like that chapter in Moby Dick with all the people in crammed into beds and little tiny rooms, and but that was about the best you could hope for in those days. Mrs. Elizabeth Sherrill was well known for her peach brandy, and you can imagine that in those days there was a lot of drinking going on in a place like this. It was called not only Sherrill's Inn but Sherrill's Tavern, and we had peach trees here on the farm. We don't think of peaches growing here, but they grew peaches, and she made this supposedly wonderful peach brandy for her guests. The Hickory Nut Gap Turnpike, like the Buncombe Turnpike, made its money by charging tolls at each county line. One of the old toll booths still exists down on the Henderson County, Rutherford County line. I was really interested to see. And there were always people herding pigs and tried to bypass those toll booths. And so there's a lot of times little side roads and stuff that you can still find. Sherrill's Inn was quite successful. And not only did people driving hogs stay here, the hog drivers, there was a pen down in the pasture here right below the house where these hogs were kept. You you could go about 10 miles a day herding hogs, and having had a little to do with hogs, I just marvel at the fact that they could get them to go 10 miles. But it generated a huge demand for corn here in the mountains. So the Sherrills would buy corn and then, jack up the price and sell it to these drovers. And it created a real income for a lot of the farmers around here. And I'm afraid it generated demand for slaves. And while we don't think of Western North Carolina having many slaves, Buncombe County did, and Fairview certainly did. But the hog business was lucrative. You could herd those hogs down to these markets in Charleston, Augusta, other places, come back with a lot of money in your pocket. You could also buy European goods down there that were quite prized, and it, it was a real economy, and it sustained people here in the mountains for that period of time. The Sherrills raised a pretty big family here. Lieutenant Francis Marion, as you know, the old Swamp Fox name, named after the Swamp Fox, Francis Marion Sherrill, joined the Confederate Army and sadly was killed at Kennesaw Mountain in 1864. In 1865, a part of Stoneman's raiders came up the mountain from Rutherfordton, and they were under the command of a Major General William Palmer, who interestingly was a Quaker. And while Quakers were anti-war, many Quakers were more anti-slavery than anti-war. Major General William Palmer was quite a fascinating guy. They came with maybe 1,000 people, 1,000 all on horses. Palmer and his crew stayed in this house, and the Sherrills had to feed them. And one of the stories that got passed down to us was one of the Sherrill daughters was frying eggs for these guys, and they were all upset about it and feeling the pressure of having them in the house. And she just took off her stockings and shook them on the eggs and said, "Them damn Yankees can eat the dirt off my feet and they'll think it's pepper." So that gives you sort of a flavor for the times. We have a lot of the old registers from the Sherrills in. They're just fascinating to look at. One of the interesting, they had little court cases or settlements. I think maybe this register was almost official documentation for some things. And one of the interesting problems they faced after the war was over was how to settle up debts that you'd incurred in Confederate money. And there was a lot of kind of back and forth about what a Confederate dollar was worth as opposed to an American dollar. And of course, by the end of the war, they weren't worth much, but there seemed to be some effort to get some of these debts paid off. In 1880, the railroad finally made it up from Old Fort, and that was, to me, the biggest historical game changer for Buncombe County. Sort of allowed Asheville to become a city, and they began to build modern, nicer hotels in Asheville, and these little country inns were not as nice and not as popular. I think a lot of times travelers who would come on the train would rent a horse and ride out here and have lunch or spend the night and then go down into the Chimney Rock area. But for the most part, after the Civil War, I think life got a lot harder here on this farm. There was even one period where they sold the place, but then bought it back. I think the new owner had visions of making money and didn't work out, so they bought it back. So everything sort of limped along. Asheville was booming. and there were two Cheryls that were living here. With neither one of them had a family, and by the about 1911, I think they had enough. They were going to impose a property tax to build a new Fairview school, and that was the last straw for them, and they sold out. And the man that bought it, just briefly, was a man named Judge Phillips, and he was an old guy, 80 years old, married to a young girl, 18 years old, and her mother. They were all living here, and that's when Annie's grandparents showed up. Jim and Elizabeth McClure. Elizabeth, as I told you, was the artist, and she, she was really taken with this place. The inn was pretty much worn down. We have pictures from when they bought it, but she saw the potential. It was a beautiful setting. She thought she would love the idea of building up the landscaping and fixing the house up and raising her family here. And they were not unlike a lot of people. They were from well-to-do suburban Chicago. They were fascinated by all the stories they had heard about Western North Carolina, the Mount Mitchell story being one of the main ones, but these fascinating people that were living here, kind of lost in time, that spoke Elizabethan English. And so they came down here on their honeymoon and were sort of looking for a place. They had their automobiles shipped down here by the train, and they started driving around, having a big old time on their honeymoon. And they came across this place, and she was taken with it. And the car, it wasn't for sale or anything, but they pulled over and walked up on the porch, and there was old man Phillips and the young girl. And Mr. McClure went to talk to the old man, and the young girl burst into tears on the porch and said, "I am just miserable here," which you all might appreciate, and said, "I'd give anything if you guys would buy this place and let me move to town." So I think she had a lot of influence, and that's what happened. And this family's been here ever since. I'm getting attacked by all the dogs in the house, but I'll try not to be bothered. One of them dropping a tennis ball on my foot. So Jim and Elizabeth began fixing up the house, and they moved in, and Jim McClure really wanted to create a farm here, and they bought land all around this house, and fixed up the barns. And they were just, I have Elizabeth's diaries that were they were so fun. They were just having a great time. And so he got sort of interested in the farmers of the region. Jim McClure was a Presbyterian minister. He was a kind of social gospel Presbyterian minister. He was looking for something great to do with his life. He'd been a minister at a couple other places before coming down here, but he really wanted to do. He was a graduate of Yale. He was just looking for a project that he could sink his teeth into. Really, he imagined that he would end up starting this farm here and then getting a big time minister's job up in New York or Baltimore. But the more he lived here and the more he got to know the people here, the more interested he got. And in 1920, they started the Fairview Farmers Federation, which was a sort of farmers co-op as a way to kind of upgrade farming skills here, to create a place where they could buy fertilizer more in bulk, and also where they could sell their produce, to create markets. It was a real visionary idea, and it was just what he was looking for. And that is what he ended up doing. And over the course of his life, he died in 1956. Over the course of his life, that federation, it went all across Western North Carolina. And in some sort of larger view, he was teaching these families how to think about the modern world, how to think about their farms not as just a sort of hand-to-mouth survival place, but as a place to invest what resources they had, to look for markets, to grow crops that that would make more money, and he developed a lot of that. It's a fascinating story, and I love talking about it, but I won't go into it so much here. The farm thrived. The Farmers Federation thrived. They raised 2 children here, Jamie and Elspeth. They were somewhat the odd family here in Fairview. They sent Jamie to Fairview School, and the Mountain Boys just pretty much would beat him up every day. So they sent him up to Hotchkiss in Connecticut. He ended up going to Yale, and he ended up dying in a freak accident on a ship during World War II off of Maine. A very, very sad story, and it was kind of just something that Elizabeth never really overcame, I don't think. Elspeth grew up here, and I think maybe some of you in listening actually knew her. She was a great character. She had her foot in both worlds, the sort of world of Asheville, the world of garden clubs, and Biltmore Club, and she also had her foot in this mountain world out here, and it gave her sort of permission to be a real character. And sometimes I think she wasn't so much unlike Nancy Ann Ashworth. And when I came here in 1969, she was the queen of this place, and it was a fascinating place. And she married her first cousin, Jamie Clark, who was Jamie McClure Clark, Elspeth with Elspeth McClure. So they were first cousins. And I like to say they really weren't from the mountains, but they sort of picked up the mountain ways. And they had 8 children. Thank the Lord, one of them being my wife, Annie. And we're all still here trying to take care of this place. As many of you may know, Jamie Clark was the congressman from Western North Carolina during the 1980s. A very exciting time here. He also worked for Warren Wilson, and there are a lot of stories about them going off to Washington and taking eggs up there to people, and it was a great time, and I won't bore you with any more of those stories. They have both passed on now. We're still running the farm. My son Jamie, our farm used to be a dairy farm. I used to run the dairy farm. Dairy farming's been really tough, really for a long time. Just with all the increases in the productive capacity of the modern dairy cow, farmers tend to overproduce milk, and the price is just always a struggle, nearly always a struggle. So my son Jamie and his wife Amy took on the farm after they both graduated from Warren Wilson, and they've really done a great job, and we appreciate everyone who comes out here to buy our meat, and who buys our meat in Ingalls and other places now where you can get it. It's grass-fed beef and what we call pastured pork. We're trying to be a leader in sustainable agriculture and in trying to rebuild our soils out here. And it's something that I'm also very interested in working on down in Raleigh. So with that, maybe I'll finish up and see if there's any questions.
All right. Well, thank you, John. Got a few questions coming in. I'll just say, as a son of a beef farmer, also, it's great to hear people talk about preserving mountain agriculture and keeping that small farm tradition alive. So we've got, like I said, a few different questions coming in. I wanted to address what you said earlier about the scald head condition. We actually had two audience members that had somewhat different explanations of that. One person,
I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, one person said that was a common name for ringworm, and then another said it was a condition literally of the scalp that caused pustules and hair falling out. So I'm interested in the source of that also.
I'm sure the diagnosis went over probably lots of different things.
Yeah. Well, so I'll get to a few of these questions here. We had someone who asked about the actual destination of the fork being driven through the Hickory Nut Gap, and they asked if it was used in the eastern part of the state or even in South Carolina, the lower country markets, to feed enslaved people.
It was the latter. One of the, this is a political problem. Nearly all of our commerce went to South Carolina. And those of us who live here can understand that. One of the reasons that they were pushing getting the railroad up here was to try to link Western North Carolina with Eastern North Carolina in some way. I think there was even some fear that Western North Carolina might just secede from the state and join South Carolina because the trade was huge. It turned out that it was much cheaper for the plantation owners to buy their hog meat from Appalachia than it was for them to raise it themselves. And so that's what was going on. And it's because it's cheap to raise here because of all the food that the hogs could eat. They were hogs being herded all the way from Kentucky down through here. The Buncombe Turnpike, the statue of the pigs in downtown Asheville there was I think in, what was it, 1850, there were 150,000 hogs went through Asheville. This wasn't the main road, but it was certainly a road that had lots of drovers on it.
Okay. Somebody wanted to know a little bit more about, you talked about the expensive fees associated with stagecoach travel. They want to know who were these people that could actually afford this, and what were their reasons for traveling, to and from Rutherford and Asheville.
And that's a great question, and I pretty much know the answer because we have these registers, and people have gone through to figure out who all these people were that stayed here. They were one group that won't surprise you. They were wealthy families from Charleston. Charleston was a money-making place, mostly with rice before cotton, and they would often send their families up here during the summer when it was hot down there, and there was yellow fever and other health problems and malaria. So they would send their families up here. Flat Rock is famous for being a real community of those kinds of people. There were also judges that were moving around from court to court in those days, and there were politicians. Millard Fillmore may have stayed here, or it may have been some child practicing their handwriting. We're not sure. But he signed in the book. And Andrew Johnson, not such a surprise. He stayed here. I think the capital of Tennessee might have still been in Jonesboro, not very far away. But it was political people, mostly people on business. In that era, trade went not only down to South Carolina, but up into East Tennessee. That's where the Buncombe Turnpike went. And that was by far the best transportation. And some say it was the best road in North Carolina of that era.
So that kind of brings to mind the question, with these more well-to-do people and drovers also using the road at the same time? Were they both sharing the inn at the same time?
Yeah, and what I've been told is that the drovers usually just curled up in front of the fireplace, and the fancier people got the beds. And I suspect that there was a range in the quality of the beds. Yeah, I don't know how all that worked out, but I think about it a lot. I just don't. I would there. My mother-in-law Elspie once wrote a play imagining those people, and there was like a murder or something in her little play. She I think she did it for school, but it really opens up the imagination for what it might have been like.
Yeah. We've got quite a few questions coming in. We probably won't get to everybody. I'm going to try to get through a few of these at least. So somebody wanted to know about the trail that goes from Smith Knolls Upper Ridge to Blue Ridge Pastures. They ask, is that the old coastal road, or do you know a name for it otherwise?
Yeah, that's a little known fact. I didn't think anybody would much know about that. Annie and I own Blue Ridge Pastures. There's a road that comes down from there and goes down to Upper Brush Creek. And on some maps, it's known as the Postal Road. And what that makes me think of, which is, astounding when you go up to a place like the Blue Ridge Pastures now, how many people lived up there. And if you hike around on that mountainside, you come across chimneys all the time for where little cabins were and where people were sort of eking out a sustenance of some sort up there. I think when all the industry came to Asheville, a lot of those people said, let's sell out and go make a little money in town. And I think Mr. McClure was able to buy a lot of those little parcels up there, and that's why we ended up with them.
Yeah. Somebody wanted to know if does the present Drovers or the present road through Hickory Nut Gap follow the traditional Drovers Road?
Well, somewhat. I'm old enough to remember the 2-lane road all the way to Asheville, and there was a road before that that you can find with little loops off of the current road. The road up the mountain went straight up, and it was there's an old bridge footings that goes across the creek down there at the bottom of this mountain. As many of you may know, one of the great events that happened here was the flood of 1916, and carved that bridge got washed out in that flood, and then when they rebuilt it and they etched into the concrete underneath the bridge, you have to kind of climb under it. You'll see the names and dates of two Merrills that were killed in that flood. So the curves. My understanding is that the curves were built in the maybe 1919, 1920. Cars weren't as powerful, so they put all those curves in there so that the Model A's and Model T's can make it up the mountain. And that was new.
Great. Somebody asked, could you briefly repeat when the Clarks came into the picture?
Yeah, so the McClures came in 1916. Aunt Elspie was born in 1923, so I guess that's the beginning. She married Jamie McClure Clark, her first cousin, in 1945. And so they raised their 8 children here over that time period.
Okay. So we had several more coming in. I think we'll try to do maybe one more here. And let's see, where should we go? Yeah, somebody wanted to know, were there turkeys also driven along this route like there was the Buncombe Turnpike.
Absolutely. They're sort of famous. I don't know. And these were somehow they were able to tame wild turkeys. These were not the kind of turkeys we think of at Thanksgiving, is my understanding. And they had special whips with felt at the end of them, because if you used a regular whip on a turkey, you'd pretty much defeather them. So they would have this special felt, and they could, I just can't imagine herding turkeys. There was usually a lead turkey, I understand. The trick was to try to get to wherever you were trying to go before the sun went down, because when the sun went down, they just all roosted in whatever tree they could find, and there you were stuck. So yeah, they're famously in ducks. There were a few ducks herded, and I don't know how the toll people charge for ducks and turkeys, but they probably had that figured out. And yeah, there was some of that, and horses and mules and cattle also were herded along the turnpike.
All right, well, great. We thank you very much for being here, John, and thank you for fielding all these questions. So, do you have any final words you want to mention?
Not really. I always enjoy having the chance to look back through all this history and think about it. And so I thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for all those great questions and for your interest. We're really thriving out here these days. Oh, here come the dogs. I better quit. I won't BS anymore on that. But the dogs like to come in here and look out the window at the squirrels that are on the bird feeder. So that's what's going on. So thank you.
All right. Well, I'll briefly make another plug also for our upcoming programs. If you enjoyed this, or if you enjoyed any of them in the past, you definitely want to check out what we have coming up in the future here. As a reminder, like I said, tonight's event is recorded, so within a few days you'll get a recording of the event, and you'll get a survey that goes out along with that as well. So if you did enjoy this event and you want to tell us about it, or if you had any other questions, just let us know. Your feedback is very important to keep these programs going. So without anything else, I'll bid everybody a good night. Thank you once again, John, for joining us. Thank you, everyone else, for joining us and all your questions. Have a good night.